Uh, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Kelly Watson earned her PhD from Bowling Green State University and currently serves as the Assistant Director of Women's and Gender Studies at West Virginia University. She is the author of numerous articles and chapters examining gender in colonial American history. Her first book, Insatiable Appetites, Imperial Encounters with Cannibals in the North Atlantic World, was published by the New York University Press in 2015. This lecture on Mary Kittamaquund, sometimes known as the Pocahontas of Maryland, was the daughter of the Piscataway tayac, or chief. At 7 years old, she was sent by her father to live in St. Mary's City in order to learn English ways from a wealthy spinster, Margaret Brent, and Governor Leonard Calvert. I should mention for everybody that where she lived, Mary Kittamaquund, with Margaret Brent, was at the Sisters' Freehold, which is where we are currently sitting or standing, depending on where you are in this room. So if you wanted a general idea of where some of these events took place, you're going to be standing at. This talk will provide an in-depth look at an important and understudied figure in Maryland early history. Furthermore, this talk shall include the role of indigenous women in colonial diplomacy and negotiation. So without further ado, Kelly Watson.
All right. Silence my phone. I think we're ready. Okay. Hold on, Okay, there we go. So first, thank you for having me. It's lovely to see all of you, and we will all be sweaty together by the end of this, but that's okay. So I'm going to discuss kind of two remarkable women, and I'm going to just for a second before I start doing that, say a bit about pronunciation. So I don't quite know, and no one does, how her name is pronounced. I might vary to say Kittamaquund or Kittamaquund, right? Those are approximations. I also just wanted to say, in terms of the name of the tribe, Piscataway, I will often say Piscataway, which is slightly closer to the pronunciation that it would have been, but neither of them are inaccurate or more accurate than the other. So if you hear me say Piscataway, that's what I'm talking about. Make sense? There we go. Okay, so I thought I'd start here with this historical marker that's in Stafford, Virginia. So it's between the post office and Route 1 in Stafford, Virginia. So I just want to read it and then kind of talk through what it says. So Mary was the only child of Kittamaquund, paramount chief of the Piscataway tribes, when Lord Baltimore's settlers arrived in Maryland in 1634. In 1641, 7-year-old Mary became the ward of Maryland Governor Leonard Calvert and his sister-in-law, Margaret Brent. 3 years later, Mary was married to Margaret Brent's 38-year-old brother, Giles Brent, who likely intended to gain control of Piscataway lands through the alliance. The Brents moved to Virginia to lands near here in 1647, where Giles and Mary had at least 3 children. Giles Brent remarried in 1654, but there are no records of Mary's death. So that's the story. This was erected in 2009. And the first thing, I'm not going to dwell on all the biographical details here that aren't quite right, but one obvious one is Margaret Brent was not Leonard Calvert's sister-in-law, but we're not going to worry too much about that. But what I actually want to focus on is the way that sort of Mary Kittamaquund appears kind of absent from this summary of her life, that her marriage is presented in passive voice. Mary was married, right? Which glosses over the fact that she was 11, firstly, but also erases kind of her agency and personhood. And she just appears as kind of a pawn of Europeans, and the story of her life is told only in relation to her encounters with other Europeans. And so I understand when you're making a historical marker, you've got 3 sentences at most, right, to make someone's life. But I was really interested in those silences about Mary's life, right? Well, why did she marry Giles? What did Giles want from it? What was the rationale here? And so I want to think about why this marriage happened, what purpose it served for both parties, and what Mary Kittamaquund's role was when she came to St. Mary's City. So to do that, I'm actually going to start, there we go, with a children's book from the 1960s. So I want to just kind of talk about some of the stereotypes about Mary and some of the things that people learn or don't learn about her before I get into what I think happened. The difficulty here is there are no records that she created that exist, and only very few records that exist that even mention her at all. So, but Mary Kittamaquund is often compared to Pocahontas, right? They both served a role as a cultural intermediary between their tribe of birth and English colonists. They both married older Englishmen, and they both died around 20 or 21. They both had children with those English husbands. And there's not nearly the preponderance of publications about Mary that there are about Pocahontas, but there are some. And so this 1967 fictional biography, which is aimed for a young adult audience, called Princess Mary of Maryland, it describes her youth among the Piscataway as idyllic. She's called Little Girl, a Little Princess in the book before she's baptized. So I just want to talk about a little bit of how she is presented here. So she's presented as precocious youth, and at one point in the book, her father is leading a royal procession, and she starts to follow him and participate in it. And the book says, as Kittamaquund turned to follow his brother, Little Girl broke away from her mother and toddled after him, saying, "Tui, tui." She was dressed up for the celebration. She wore a string of blue beads around her neck and a small red feather tied to her hair with a slim doeskin thong. Everybody laughed seeing her. "Come back, little girl, come back," her mother said. "She does not know that a woman must be quiet before men." Little Girl folded her tiny arms, pulled in her chin, and stalked behind her father, stepping high, imitating him. So the story obviously is written in the 20th century, but it reinforces really European ideas about womanhood and what women should do and what women should be, and then superimposes them upon the Piscataway. And it makes it seem that in all cultures, men have power and women are docile. In Princess Mary of Maryland, this little girl is sent to St. Mary's City at age 7 to learn English ways after her father inherits the tayac position. She quickly learns to thrive amongst her admirable new guardian, Margaret Brent, and a few years later, when Mary's father dies, her future seems uncertain, and the heroic Giles Brent steps in to give Mary a proper place in the world. Their marriage ensures that Mary can be fully integrated into European society and the patriarchal order. Giles claims that this marriage proposal is motivated primarily out of a desire to protect Mary's interests. In the book, Giles tells his sister Margaret that, quote, "If I were to marry her while I am governor," he was acting governor at this particular time, "I might be able to claim her inheritance for her," end quote. When Margaret questions his motivations for marrying such a young girl, in the book, her age is mysteriously left vague. Giles casts doubt and says, no. Many young women are married in England at age 11, at her age, and I'll wager that all Indian girls marry earlier still. When Giles finally approaches Mary herself about their potential union, she's caught off guard. In fact, she starts crying and says, "I'm not worthy of you. My father is a murderer." But finally she's convinced and she says, "Yes, yes, yes," exclamation points, all caps. And then in the book, the two live happily ever after. And the book ends with Mary telling her children Bible stories in front of the fire while Giles smokes his pipe and looks on. So this is a particularly kind of egregious and inaccurate version of her life, but it highlights some of the problems that have plagued the scholarship thus far. And given the fact that there is very little English evidence and virtually no evidence from the Piscataway, telling a story about Mary is really hard, right? At best, you have to work from other contexts and read between the lines, and at worst, you invent things. But Mary's life was not a beautiful romance or a story of redemption. Giles was not a hero. He was not the perfect husband. When he and Mary Kittamaquund wed, she was 11 and he was 38 or 40. And so in spite of this discomforting age difference, it's also important that we treat Mary as a person who could make choices. Perhaps she didn't have the ability to make all the choices in her life, but she was still a person who is not simply a pawn of other people. And so I think her life reveals the messy and uncomfortable realities of Anglo-Indian encounters in the early 17th century Chesapeake. So I'm going to talk just for a little bit about the Piscataway Confederacy, give a brief overview there. So in late 1660, the governor of the English colony of Maryland, who at the time was Philip Calvert, asked the brother of the Piscataway tayac. The English use the word emperor. Tayac in this context refers to the leader of the Confederacy. So he asks the brother of the tayac about how leadership is determined, how we choose the next tayac. And in his response, the man whose name is Utapangasanum indicates that the Piscataway originally moved from the eastern shore of Maryland to the western shore and had inhabited this region for more than 13 generations before 1660. The archaeological evidence is a little less clear than that and suggests actually a more northerly movement in the 14th century. But either way, the Piscataway were an Algonquin-speaking people who inhabited the land south of present-day DC, between the eastern shore of the Potomac River and the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So kind of a little bit north of where we are, but also here as well. By the end of the 17th century, a significant portion of the tribe had settled farther north and west up the Potomac. And by the second decade of the 18th century, the historical record indicates that a large faction of Piscataway had left Maryland, but tribal tradition maintains that many stayed and many returned. And this is important because we know that in 2012, the state of Maryland formally recognized its first indigenous tribes of the Piscataway Nation and the Piscataway Indian Nation. And so we know that oral history doesn't just say that everyone left and came back, but that there was a continued existing presence of people. So between the first English contact that the Piscataway had with John Smith, pictured here, and the arrival of the Ark and the Dove in 1634, carrying the Maryland colonists, the Piscataway found themselves facing increasing threats to their lands and sovereignty from Virginia, the English colony of Virginia to the south, Iroquoian groups to the north, and other Algonquin tribes to the east. And it's possible that the English Virginians were not the first Europeans that they met, as the Spanish did have a presence in that part of Virginia for about a century beforehand. But that doesn't really matter for this story. I just think it's interesting. But the Piscataway Confederacy starts to consolidate power more centrally after 1575. And this is a pretty common pattern of behavior for groups who are in the sphere of influence of Europeans. And as those threats grow and as power dynamics shift, there's a consolidation of power. But the term Piscataway or Piscataway can refer to the members of the Confederacy, to the central Piscataway tribe itself, to a language, to a culture, and some towns. So the word doesn't really give you that much insight of, are we talking about the central Piscataway tribe of a couple hundred people? Are we talking of the larger Confederacy? But at its height, about a century before contact with Anglo-Virginians, the Confederacy received tribute between 7,000 and 8,500 people, including from the Anacostans, the Portabac, the Mattawamans, Nanjemoy, and some other tribes. So as a confederacy, it was a tribute-based confederacy, a loose affiliation, not a military, dictatorship, but each of these tribes would pay tribute to the Central Piscataway Confederacy for protection and diplomacy. So historian James Rice argues that in the later 15th and early 16th century, the Piscataway tribe itself, not the Confederacy, just the central tribe with that name, consisted of about 425 individuals. Rice also indicates that the tribe fielded 80 warriors in 1676, nearly as many as they had in 1608. If we take allied villages of members of the Confederacy, not just the Central Piscataway Nation, we get about 2,500 to 5,700 people in most of the 17th century. The Central Piscataway tribe itself may have been reduced to as few as 320 people by 1680. But in spite of this, and in spite of everything I just said, comparatively to other tribes in the region, they actually, in terms of sheer numbers, fared fairly well. Their numbers were relatively consistent. But at the same time that their numbers were dwindling and decreasing perhaps not as rapidly as others, the population of Anglo-Marylanders increased to about 20,000 by 1680. So Piscataway relations with the Virginia colony became strained after 1622 when Governor Sir Francis Wyatt blamed a deadly Indian uprising on the Piscataway. And the following year, 90 Englishmen attacked the key Piscataway town of Moyon, killing villagers and destroying homes and crops. The Moyon Reserve there, there's a historic park, but there's also, it's just a development, like a housing development that you can buy houses in. So this incursion forced the Piscataway to move their stronghold further inland for protection. And the tribe also faced growing pressures from the recent movement of Iroquoian tribes like the Erie, the Susquehannock, the Massawomack into the Chesapeake region, and other local tribes like the Yaucomico were also competing for European alliances. And the Yaucomico had sought English alliances pretty early, and the Piscataway Confederacy feared that they might lose out if they didn't get in there first. And they had a whole bunch of other people vying for power, like William Claiborne, who had settled in Kent Island, and Kent Island now becomes part of Maryland, and he doesn't like that. And there's a lot of friction between all of the parties vying for this land that the Piscataway live on. Henry Fleet in Virginia was another prominent Virginian angling for rights within this region. But when Leonard Calvert and the Maryland colonists arrive in Piscataway lands in 1634, the presiding tayac, whose name was Wanas, who is Mary Kittamaquund's uncle, approached them with considerable caution and concern. When Calvert asked for permission to build a settlement in the area, Wanas replied, quote, "He would not bid him go, neither would he bid him stay, but that he might use his own discretion," which I think is a really diplomatic and good political move there. So Andrew White, in spite of saying they were welcomed warmly, also tells us that there were a couple hundred bowmen there to meet Calvert. So Wanas' carefully crafted statement enabled the Piscataway to open the door for friendly relations with the English without endangering the welfare of the tribe. Right? You can settle here if you want, but the English ultimately choose to settle where we are now, right, in a former Yaucomico village that we come to know as St. Mary's City. And this decision to settle on lands that the Yaucomico had left might have influenced the decision of the Piscataway to seek closer relationships with the English, right? They wanted to get in and secure their role in the fur trade as quickly as possible. But for the next 2 years, there we go. For the next 2 years, under the leadership of Wanas, the Piscataway lived relatively undisturbed by the English. They were farther up the Potomac River. But in 1636, Wanas was killed, allegedly by his younger brother and Mary's father, Kittamaquund, which is why in the fictional book she cries and says, "I'm the daughter of a murderer." The only evidence we have for that is that Europeans tell us that, but it circulates throughout all of the literature. And many scholars have assumed that as the new tayac, Kittamaquund forged closer ties with the English to cement his tenuous claims to this ill-gotten title. Piscataway scholar Gabrielle Tayac suggests that Kittamaquund might actually have been encouraged by the English to overthrow his brother because he was friendlier to their desires. But similarly to leadership positions in other Algonquin tribes, the role of tayac wasn't based on force or coercion, but tribute and alliances. Kittamaquund likely saw an alliance with the English as perhaps the only way he could maintain his position, and the Piscataway could weather the growing threats of Iroquoian tribes to the north. And initially, the relationship was mutually beneficial. Anglo-Marylanders consistently called Kittamaquund emperor and Mary princess, as was common in English writings about indigenous leadership in other contexts. By assuming that the tayac position was equivalent to something like an emperor or king, however, the English also assumed that that inheritance would pass through in ways that made sense to them. So if Mary is a princess, she will inherit something. And they also assumed that friendship with the tayac would involve then the ability to have influence over local politics. But the tayac did not wield absolute power over subordinate people, and Indian power structures and matrilineal descent did not leave Mary actually in a position to inherit. And I'll talk about that in probably way too much detail later. So the instability of the Chesapeake region in the early 18th century finally pushed the Piscataway farther up and west and north in the Potomac. The last settlement, right, the historic literature that doesn't acknowledge that people did stay, says that the last settlement of the Piscataway was on Heater's Island, which is also known as Conway Island, which is now managed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And I guess it's not really a fun fact. My great-grandfather was Philip Heater and actually lived on the island and were the white family that took it over after the Piscataway left. But the Piscataway reportedly left after several disputes with the Anglo population, conflicts over the death of an enslaved man whose death they were blamed for, unclear land claims that led to accusations of Indians killing English hogs, English attempts to drive natives off the land by destroying their crops and their fences and things like that. But the departure, if this was 1634, the departure of the Piscataway would have been a major blow to the safety of the English settlement. But by the end of the 17th century, the Anglo-Maryland colonists increasingly started to see the indigenous population as a nuisance and not as potential allies. So a significant number of the Piscataway eventually did settle among the Seneca, and there's some evidence of some treaties that are signed by the Seneca with kind of Piscataway representation. But by 1704, when, according to the Marylanders, the Piscataway failed to come to a meeting they called, they decided to consider them basically extinct. Obviously, that is an oversimplification. I'm just talking about it from the English perspective. But sometime in 1633 or 1634, an unnamed woman who was married to Kittamaquund, the brother of the presiding tayac at the time, gave birth to a baby girl. We don't have a record of what her name was before she was given the Catholic name Mary. But after her conversion, she became known as Mary Kittamaquund, which again is following a European pattern of using her father's name as her surname. But after securing the friendship of the Piscataway, the Catholic leadership in St. Mary's City wanted the Jesuit missionaries they had brought with them to, quote, convert, civilize, and control the tribe. So Andrew White was sent to establish a mission among the Piscataway in 1639. And according to his records, he was warmly welcomed and lived in tayac Kittamaquund's house. In his first report about Maryland, though, even before he came to live with Kittamaquund, White devoted a lot of space to talking about the cultures of Chesapeake Indians, and he described their sexual and marriage customs this way. Quote, they hold it lawful to have many wives, but all keep the rigor of conjugal faith to their husbands. The very aspect of woman is modest and grave. They are generally so noble as you can do them no favor, but they will return it. There is small passion among them. If they were once Christian, they would doubtless be a virtuous and renowned nation. They exceedingly desire civil life and Christian apparel. So White presents Chesapeake Indians as tractable, right, peaceful, open to European contact, and his description of Indian women as modest, loyal, and generous and dispassionate is interesting in light of the marriage of Giles and Mary shortly thereafter. This is one of the few records of the Piscataway language. It's a catechism. So in 1639, Andrew White goes and lives among the Piscataway, where he is able to miraculously cure the tayac from a terrible disease using some bloodletting and some holy water. Sorry, there's also a certain powder of known efficacy mixed with holy water. So in 1640, White's efforts at Christianizing the population seemed to be paying off, as Kittamaquund, his wife, and two of his daughters converted to Catholicism. And a few months later, in June of 1640, most of the family, along with a leading Werowance, so Werowance was a leader of a smaller unit within the Confederacy, they were formally baptized. White also reported that tayac Kittamaquund, who received the baptismal name Charles, quote, put his concubines away from him. And it's likely that concubines in this context means wives in a polygynous household. But sometime between his conversion to Catholicism and his baptism, Kittamaquund decided to send his 7-year-old daughter to St. Mary's City to learn English ways and customs. In the annual relation, the Jesuit report of 1640, when the Jesuits arrived at the Piscataway principal town on the 15th of February, and, quote, not long after, the king brought his daughter, 7 years old, whom he loves with great affection, to be educated among the English at St. Mary's, and when she shall well understand the Christian mysteries, to be washed in the sacred font of baptism. So that's the earliest record we have of her life, right? If we're talking about European records. And the only record or way we can determine her age is from this accounting, is that Andrew White says she's 7 years old in 1640. So how good a Jesuit priest was of estimating the ages of indigenous children is up to you. I don't know, but it's the best that we have. So the dynamics of families, particularly fathers and daughters, were quite different in matrilineal Algonquin communities than they were in English society. And nearby Senecomica, which is the Powhatan term for the lands over which they held influence, fathers were not typically engaged in the day-to-day rearing of their children. Rather, the child's maternal uncle, who would be of her clan in a way that her father would not, right? Clan is matrilineal, was actually the one most in charge of kind of the day-to-day rearing. And fathers were seen as indulgent, right? The way we might see like a fun uncle today, right? That's how fathers were perceived. And so both Mary and Pocahontas are described in European literature as their father's favorite, right? As the apple of their eye. And that could very well be because that's how fatherhood was sort of constructed in this particular space. So he's indulgent and he's not the disciplinarian. And because of this, right, Europeans also like to write about how they sent their favorite, most precious daughter, right? It buoys all of their egos in that way. So her presence among the English would have been a benefit to her father in the sense that she is learning how to communicate with these people. She's becoming this cultural intermediary, and it would have benefited the English for similar reasons, and it would have stoked their ego to know they have a princess, right? But given the differences between the Julian and Gregorian calendars, which is a very boring explanation that I could talk to you about I spent way too much time. The New Year started in March. So sometimes if it's like March of 1640 something, it's actually the year before. So that's why you'll see sometimes slash marks of like 1633/4 that happen the beginning of the year. Then you're never quite sure what year it was. Anyway, but given the difference, it's not quite sure if Mary comes to St. Mary's City in 1640 or 1641. I think it's 1640, but that's for boring reasons that we don't necessarily need to know here. But one of the things that I think supports that is that during that description of Kittamaquund's baptism, she's not there because she is formally baptized later. And so to me, that gives credence that after his conversion and before his baptism, she is sent to St. Mary's City. So we know she's actually not officially baptized till 1642. So moving to the other side of the story, to the Brents, right, which are probably the more familiar part. So I want to just give some context about them before we get into Mary's life with the Brents. So while Mary Kittamaquund was growing up in the throes of colonialism and change and struggle, the Brent family immigrated to Maryland and established themselves as wealthy, influential planters. In a 1934 article from the Maryland Historical Magazine, which has the wonderful title, Mistress Margaret Brent, Spinster, Julia Cherry Sproul wrote, "This remarkable woman was not only the most conspicuous of her sex, but one of the most prominent personages in the colony, whose business and public activities filled many pages of court records and suggest a career which the most ambitious of modern feminists might envy." End quote. So Sproul's rather hyperbolic statement, which I'll talk about in a second, underscores a lot of the assumptions that have been made about Brent. Particularly that, and this may not be popular, that she was not really concerned about women's rights writ large. She was concerned about her rights. She did not ask for women's right to vote. She asked for Margaret's right to vote. So she did not actively challenge the position of women within colonial English society, even though she didn't conform to many of the norms. That doesn't mean she actually tried to change other people's positions. So she might not have adhered to the standards of womanhood, but she certainly didn't challenge them. And I might argue that marrying off your 11-year-old foster daughter to your brother is not something modern feminists might envy. But for such a well-known figure in the colonial Chesapeake, we actually don't know that much about Brent's life in England. We know that that's Lark Stoke, that's their sort of the Brent ancestral home and the Brent family crest. But we do know that in 1638, just 4 years after Calvert had arrived, Margaret, her sister Mary, who's also an unmarried spinster, and her brother Giles, and also their brother Fulk, immigrated to the colony. Fulk did not stay very long, so he exits the story quite early. But the Brent sisters were given their own land grants by Lord Baltimore Cecil Calvert, and they would have been minor nobility back in England and probably fairly recent Catholic converts. And they were distant relatives of the Calvert family, who were the proprietors of the colony. So she's not Leonard Calvert's sister-in-law. If I'm remembering correctly, Calvert married a woman whose name was Anne Brent, but they were not like closely related in any way. But somebody out here might know more about those details than I do. But Margaret Brent was approximately 37 years old when she arrived in Maryland. And she had not married in England, which seems remarkable, but actually, statistically, about 30% of women in England weren't married. And that includes widows and those who never married. But the population of never married women was actually larger than that of widows. So it wasn't as unusual as we might think, but it has led a lot of people to suspect that Margaret Brent was either a lay nun or had made some sort of vow of celibacy. I don't necessarily buy that, and I can get into that in Q&A if anyone wants to hear my thoughts about it. But it is unusual for a woman to be unmarried in the English colonies, however, when there is a deeply skewed sex ratio. In this area is about 6 to 1. So there were 6 men for every 1 woman. So for 2 unmarried women to move to the colony and remain unmarried was unusual. And Maryland had somewhat more generous head right policies for women than other colonies, that specifying that any woman that shall transport herself or any children under the age of 6 years old shall be given the same grants as any man. So in other words, any adult who could pay their own transport would be granted land, and they would also be granted land for any servants or children that they brought with them. You got a slightly smaller head right for any female servants you brought than male servants. But Margaret quickly amassed a substantial amount of land and spent a lot of her time before the court arguing for her protection of property, arguing for her right to petition the court, right? And what she's most famous for is that petition in 1647/1648. So you probably may be familiar with this context, so I'll just go over it quite quickly. But on his deathbed, Leonard Calvert, who was the governor, brother of the Lord Proprietor, named her the executrix, which is a fun word for a female executor, named her the executrix of his estate. And he had significant debts from the Protestant rebellion, from Ingles' rebellion in the English Civil War. And he instructed Brent to, quote, take all and pay all. And she took this mandate literally. And she first paid the troops that he'd hired to help protect the colony from his estate. And there was a lot of kind of discontent in this period about Calvert control, and she wanted to settle that. And so she wanted to relieve some of the debts and food shortages. So on January 3rd of 1648, she requested and received authority from the Assembly to serve as the attorney for Lord Baltimore. So that's not Leonard Calvert's attorney, that's Cecil Calvert's attorney. So she receives basically the right to act on their behalf. And a short time later, on January 21st, she appears before the Assembly and makes that unprecedented request for vote and voice, essentially requesting 2 votes. One for herself as a landowner, and one for herself as the attorney for Lord Baltimore. She is denied both. Thomas Green denies the request. Brent continues then to try to settle Leonard Calvert's estate and the colony's finances by selling some of Lord Baltimore's cattle, which makes Cecil Calvert really mad. So there comes this dispute then between the Calverts and Margaret Brent. And the Colonial Assembly is kind of defending Brent, but ultimately this sort of sullies her reputation and her ability to maintain that power in Maryland. And so it kind of facilitates her movement to Virginia, where she moves around 1650. So she and her sister Mary set up near Stafford, Virginia. There's a plaque there. They're named as the first Roman Catholic European settlers of Virginia, which is odd given that there were Spanish people there before, but that's all right. But in Virginia, she continues to amass land. She's immensely wealthy, right? She has a lot of property. And when she dies, ultimately in 1671, she leaves half of her Maryland investments to her nephew, James Clifton, and the rest of her estates in Maryland, Virginia to Giles Brent. So when she came to St. Mary's, Mary Kittamaquund was entrusted then to dual guardians of Leonard Calvert and Margaret Brent. So I initially had thought Sisters Freehold was a slightly different place, and I learned today that no, it is in fact where we are right now. So she lived here, and she lived with Margaret Brent. We don't really know kind of what role Leonard Calvert actually played in her day-to-day upbringing. There's some interesting disputes over cattle between the two of them before she's married, but it seems that Margaret Brent did a lot of the day-to-day work as she lived with Margaret and Mary Brent. Mary Brent gets short shrift in all the stories, as she wasn't the one who argued before the Assembly for her right to vote, but she was also unmarried and she also was wealthy and had a lot of land. So at Sisters Freehold, that's where Mary Kittamaquund was tasked with learning English, learning about Catholicism, and getting baptized. So by sending Mary to live with the Brents and the Calverts, two really prominent personages in the colony, right? You send your princess to be with the most elite members of the society. It ensured that the Piscataway and the English, that their fates would be inextricably intertwined. And we don't know exactly, right, on a day-to-day basis, we have no idea what Mary's life was like. But we do know that in 1641, her father cedes much of his authority to Calvert's government. Why this happens, I don't quite know, but he gives actually the power to name his successor to the Calverts. Calverts will never use it, it seems, but so while she's learning sort of English ways, her father is making the Piscataway Confederacy subordinate to the English. And some have speculated that this ability to let the Calverts choose the next tayac was to set Mary up as the next tayac so that they would choose her. But it's a believable scenario, but not one that we could prove. But it doesn't appear that they actually did that. And the succession of tayacs followed older patterns. But her life gets even more complicated later that year when her dad dies. And her inheritance is unclear, and her uncle, Wekukaso, assumes the tayac position. I will briefly touch on the matrilineal descent, but it is also complicated and tedious. So as a result of the death, the Piscataway start to kind of pull away from their relationship with English, right? Kittamaquund was deeply invested in English trade, and once he dies, they start to pull back a little bit, and the Susquehannocks start raiding more into Piscataway territory, and the Jesuits abandon their mission in 1642. So Mary's life changed dramatically again just a few years later, and we don't know the exact date of this dramatic change, but we know that she and Giles Brent were married probably sometime between the summer of 1644 and October of 1644. So again, if we think back to, she's described as 7 years old in 1640, that makes her 11. So the kind of documentation that we know they were married comes from a January 1644, 1645 record of a dispute with Leonard Calvert over some cattle. Their marriage is just referenced in passing. It says the petition of Giles Brent, Esquire, and of Mary, his wife. So that's all that we have in terms of any formal documentation of their marriage, other than other people saying they were married, right? The fact that this wedding likely took place when Leonard Calvert was not in the colony and Giles Brent was serving as acting governor has led a lot of people to think that Leonard Calvert was not particularly pleased about this action. He wasn't displeased enough to not name Margaret Brent his executrix, so take that with a grain of salt. But when they were married, she was 11, as many sources either kind of leave her age out, just leave it vague, or try to make her closer to like 16 or kind of the 19 that Pocahontas is. But whether we can trust Andrew White's approximation of her age exactly, she was clearly a prepubescent girl, right? And Lois Carr, right, famed Southern Maryland historian, she argued that while marriage between a woman so young would have been unusual, that there are a couple of records of 12-year-olds getting married in the colonial record, and this was a result of that extraordinarily skewed sex ratio of 6 men to every 1 woman. And that makes sense on the one hand, but if we take into account the fact that there are indigenous peoples, right, that a skewed sex ratio is only counting English people, it changes a little bit, but we also know that English colonists in the Chesapeake were far less likely to have relationships with indigenous people, right? We know that in French colonies and in Spanish colonies, having relationships and children with indigenous women was part of the kind of diplomatic strategy. And we don't see that happening as much here, but I actually think that with Mary Kittamaquund, we see that happening in one of the rare instances. Pocahontas, sort of a similar way. Her marriage to John Rolfe is a little bit more complicated. And there is some indication that Pocahontas was actually married before she married John Rolfe to an indigenous man. Whether that was a kind of a childhood betrothal, we don't know. His name was Cocoon. But once her father dies, right? Mary is left in this kind of precarious situation in which her dad was not all that popular because he theoretically murdered his brother to gain that power. And so where she sits for Giles Brent, this is an opportune moment to think about that inheritance, right? So while her father was alive, he expected Mary to function as kind of his ambassador, right? As a cultural intermediary, tasked with learning English customs and ways. And if we take other contexts, English notwithstanding, Spanish and French contexts, women like Mary would have been tasked with having children that would be kind of the standard bearers and the intermediaries in other contexts, right? Even Columbus has children throughout the Caribbean that then serve as the intermediary between their mother's family and their father's. And so to me, that's how I view this marriage, right? Is that it's this intention of, we can scoop this princess up. If she has a child, that child will be of two worlds and can be that go-between. So it'd be easy on the English side to sort of dismiss that as a motive, but for Giles, her inheritance seems to be the primary motive of his marriage. So the identity of Mary's foster parents, right, the kind of absent father figure, Leonard Calvert, who had a family of his own, and the unmarried Margaret Brent, put her in this unusual situation right from the start. And the fact that Margaret wasn't married meant that she was able to retain the full rights to her significant landholdings and was able to conduct business more easily than if she had been married, right? Under the system of coverture, any of the stuff that she had, if she got married, would become her husband's, and she would not even have the ability to will it completely to those that she wanted to. So some argue that, right, Margaret never married because she was a devout Catholic and had taken a vow of celibacy. I see it actually as a little bit more kind of opportunistic in that she could retain the rights to all of her stuff if she didn't marry. But by adopting Mary Kittamaquund and having Mary wed her brother, she kind of taps into that network of familial power that she otherwise didn't have because she was an unmarried woman without children. And Anglo-colonial women were taught that their power, their true power, came through motherhood. And so we can't prove that Margaret Brent, in spite of lots of people trying to tell us that she also was sexless, right? That she was unmarried and therefore never had sex. We can't prove that in any way, but we know that she didn't engage in traditionally feminine pursuits. But through Mary Kittamaquund, Margaret Brent might have been able to access some of those avenues of power that accompanied marriage and procreation that she herself had been denied by the 17th century cultural norms. And thus, both tayac Kittamaquund, when he was alive, and all of the Brents, not just Giles, benefited from this marriage. For Margaret specifically, the marriage of Giles and Mary can be viewed as more than just a blatant attempt to obtain control over Piscataway lands, but also a way for her to legitimately access the power that came through the traditional patriarchal family. Where are we on time? Okay, so I'm gonna skip some stuff. That's what we're doing. So there's a lot of questions about actually whether or not Mary would have inherited anything, right? And this is, I could go on for a long time about whether or not Mary actually would have inherited anything. She was not a princess in the sense that she would have suddenly become the leader, or it didn't work that way. And Algonquin societies were matrilineal, but it seems that the position of tayac, this is where it gets really complicated, was matrilineal, but only held by men. And so the next successor to her father would have been the closest male relative on their mother's side. It would have been a person with the same clan membership. And so the Brents may have thought that her son with Giles would have been a great contender, but actually it wouldn't have been that way. So everyone assumes, and I think correctly, that the Brents are in it to get her inheritance, but it doesn't work, essentially. It fails. So could she have inherited? Probably not. There's your summary. So Mary's life is short and full of heartache in many ways. So during Ingles' Rebellion, during that portion of the English Civil War that happens in Maryland, Giles is taken captive and actually sent back to England. So he's gone for about a year. So keep in mind, they got married about a year before when she was 11. Mary dies when she's about 20 or 21. She gives birth to at least 3 and as many as 6 children. So arguments that this was just a political marriage, that they didn't consummate it, that it wasn't a 40-year-old having sex with with 11-year-old, I don't particularly buy when you actually look at the number of months that they could have spent together if she gave birth to the largest number of children we think she could have. That marriage was consummated pretty early on. So Giles is taken captive, and when he finally returns in kind of 1646, they decide to move to Virginia because, again, the Brent's reputation has not been kind to them. And so they moved to Virginia, to a place on Aquia Creek they named Peace. They also later moved to a place called Retirement. So whether or not this marriage was part of the reason why the Brents became so unpopular is another thing people have speculated about. We know why Margaret Brent becomes kind of unpopular, but there's a lot of speculation that other members of the colonial leadership see the Brents as scheming, and that they married this girl as a way to get more power and more money. And so the Brents kind of lose some standing. And rumors about that happen consistently. In late 1684, Leonard Calvert's cousin is attending a conference to settle some disputed land claims. And he says, Captain Brent, who in right of his wife, the Piscataway emperor's daughter and only child, that's not true, pretended a right to the most of Maryland, but he could do no good on it after a great bustle about it. I'd like to know what the bustle was, but we don't. But by late 1654, there are no more records of Mary. And so we presume that she's dead because Giles Brent remarries in 1655 to a widow named Frances Whitgreaves Harrison. We can't prove that she dies, and there are a number of people who speculate that maybe she doesn't, maybe she returns to the tribe of her birth. I don't necessarily buy that for a number of reasons, not least of which the Piscataway have moved a whole bunch of times. Her dad wasn't all that popular, and she hadn't lived there in 13 years. And if she did that, she also left her children with Giles. Marriages in Piscataway tradition were dissolvable if parties were unhappy. So she might have seen the marriage as a kind of temporary moment, but we don't know. So there's a silence in historical record after that. But given how young she was when they were married, the fact that Mary Kittamaquund gave birth to probably 5 or 6 children, 2 or 3 of whom, I know this is all speculative, 2 or 3 of whom survived to adulthood. So she would have been pregnant for a full 5 years out of the decade that she and Giles were married. And given that Giles was gone for a year, right, the time for her to be pregnant was further reduced. And I think it feels comfortable to some people to imagine that Giles Brent was only a scheming man who wed Mary for her inheritance, but to acknowledge that he also engaged in a sexual relationship with a very young girl is pretty uncomfortable, right? We'd rather see him as just greedy and also not, to use the word pedophile would be historically inaccurate, but today that's what we would say. We don't know Mary's level of romantic interest in Giles. And even when we look at kind of 17th century practices, a 40-year-old and 11-year-old still would have been seen as pretty unsavory. 12 was typically the age of consent, but the age of consent didn't apply to indigenous women. And it certainly didn't ruin Giles's reputation or future marriage prospects. And the psychological toll on Mary wouldn't have been much of a consideration. Giles Brent Jr., I can talk about this more later, also has a fun career in Bacon's Rebellion that he participates in. But the remnants of Mary Kittamaquund Brent's life are scattered, sparse, and frustrating, and we're left with more questions than clear answers. We want to tell a story that makes sense, right? That gives us emotional response. We want to know how she felt, how she understood. Did she hate Giles? Did she care for him? Did she have Stockholm syndrome, right? We want to know these things. And we want to know if she identified more with English or with the Piscataway, or if she was truly kind of devout in her Catholic faith, but we just can't. And I think allowing her life to exist in the confusing and fragmented way that it does is the best that we can do for her. She lived, but she didn't exist for us to study, right? Would she care that we don't know these details? And our desires to see the gaps of her life filled in and our desires to see her as a heroine or a victim are our desires, not hers. And they wouldn't have been legible to her. Maybe she was some of these things, maybe she was none of them. But she lived and she died. And there's not that much else that we can know about her interior life. So, the end. Now I'm going to fan myself. Okay. Questions? Wait, there's a slide that says that. There you go. And this is the 2012 recognition ceremony for the first 2 state recognized tribes.
Any questions?
Complaints are also acceptable, right?
How about an observation?
Observations are great and welcome.
Well, the Marylanders arrived in Chesapeake sometime in February, probably.
Mhm.
They didn't officially claim the colony until the 25th of March, because that was New Year's Day.
See, that's the Julian and Gregorian calendar difference.
And,
Yep.
That way they didn't have to pay rent the year before.
Ah, smart. Excellent. Other question? Yeah.
I did notice on the dates you had for the kids,
Mhm.
the children,
Yeah.
that they were all in the 50s.
Yeah.
So they're not listed for the 40s. And she would have still been young. I mean, he was gone for a year,
Right.
but it could mean that there was some waiting, at least. I mean, I'm not.
No, I know what you're saying. It
I'm
could.
not at all apologizing.
No, but it definitely could.
But it does, especially if she really was that young.
Right.
You know, she wouldn't necessarily be, you know.
Right. At least the kids who can be verified and who survived were born when she was a little bit older. And so, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't see any dates.
Yeah, this Margaret Brent child might be the first one. It was like stillborn, but again, we can't prove any of that. Yeah.
We don't know if Father Andrew like had 7. Yeah,
Exactly. Right.
How old she was.
Right. How good a celibate English priest is at
Yeah.
guessing children's ages.
Well, he had been a university professor.
Yeah, he was a pretty bright guy, but
Okay.
I'm a university professor and I'm not great at guessing kids' ages. So
But I'll admit that Princess Mary of Maryland book
Mhm.
was one of my favorites when I was a little girl.
That's
When I was a little girl, a long time ago.
it's a lovely story. Yeah.
To read it today, you can.
No.
It's hard. It's like the author made it into this romantic story. And,
Yeah.
You know, it's really kind of sad.
It's very sad. Well, because they don't indicate that she dies at 20 or 21, right? Yeah, in the book, they're growing old together, sitting by the fire, reading Bible stories to their kids when Giles is remarried and she's dead. So, any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
His son was
Yeah.
Junior was a little harsh. too.
Yeah, Giles Brent Jr. was a complicated figure as well.
Isn't he the first? Well, his wife was the first person in Virginia to be granted
Yeah.
divorce by the assembly.
So that's one of the sort of unverifiable but possibly true, right, things that circulates is that Giles Brent Jr. His wife gets the first divorce in Virginia because he was so cruel and horrible. So
And he was referred to in the records as half-breed. Also.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm confusing him.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I don't have a good feeling about either of them. So
So you have the 3 children listed that cannot be fully verified.
Mhm.
Is that because it's not in the record, or?
yeah, it's because so this is largely pulled from Lois Carr's research, and Lois Carr spent a lot of time documenting kind of every person who existed in this sphere. And so she finds some kind of tantalizing evidence that these people existed, and they are linked in, like Catherine Marsham is linked in some sources as one of their children. But
Yeah, 'cause that's who I'm descended from.
yeah, And so it's entirely possible that she is. It can't be proven because the other three are mentioned in wills. And so we have a solid record. Doesn't mean that she wasn't, but it just means that she may not have lived long enough to be willed something, or she had married and kind of went away. But Giles Brent Jr., Richard Brent, and Mary Brent Fitzherbert were willed things. And so there's a clear record of their existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I think there's some DNA work that's been done about Catherine Brent Marsham, and it seems compelling, right, that there is that link.
Yeah, one of my family members did the lineage back, and
Yeah.
she has her listed as 1649.
Yeah.
So I don't know how.
No.
if that's true or not.
Yeah, I wrote question mark, right? 1650. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting. And I haven't had a ton of time to go through kind of all of that lineage, but
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
yeah. Well, thank you all. And I'll take any questions. Feel free to email me. There it is. Thanks for coming. Thanks for suffering through this heat wave with